small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And those were the words 44 years ago today. Commander Neil Armstrong as he touched down on the surface of the moon, July 21st, 1969. Welcome back to your Sunday morning, 92.7 WGMD, WGMD.com. I am very, very fortunate to have with me this morning on the phone current president of Resort Broadcasting, Mr. David Schoumacher, and former CBS News correspondent who was, I guess, caught up as anyone could be in the Apollo space program. And David, I know you don't generally like to do this, but I very much appreciate you agreeing to come on the air with me this morning to talk about the Apollo 11 moon landing. Thank you.
Well, you're sure you don't have the wrong guy? I'm not that old.
I was 12 that day, and I remember it distinctly, and I'm sure you do as well.
Well, yes, and but I think that the memories of people who were involved in it, whether they were in the space program or reporting on the space program,
yes,
may be slightly skewed because we were all so busy and concentrating on our jobs. And I really sort of missed that moment of national exultation because I couldn't afford to take it.
Yeah.
Didn't have the time. But when you think about what happened in space from the time that the Russians lost Sputnik
right,
until we landed on the moon, and it was one long series of really disasters from the Kennedy Khrushchev meeting in Vienna to the Bay of Pigs to the Cuban Missile Crisis. We just had the kind of, and then of course all of the Vietnam War and attendant demonstrations.
Yes,
we'd really kind of been wandering around, and there in the background, steadily plodding ahead with only a couple of setbacks, was NASA and the space program.
Yes,
and then when that moment came, when it launched, particularly. Because then I was out with people. I was down at the Cape, and
right.
There was a huge crowd there. I was covering the VIPs in the stand. And incidentally, I don't want to exaggerate my role in CBS coverage. I was just a spear carrier. It was, of course, all Walter all the time.
But there are record of your reports on YouTube, David, so...
Well... I had to wait until Walter had to go to the bathroom.
I see.
And unfortunately, he was also very young then, too, and had wonderful kidneys and bladder. And so I didn't get on the air as much as I wanted. But the launch that day, from the time of the first sunrise, up until that time we had seen Apollo gleaming under spotlights,
right?
And you can't really see the spacecraft almost for the huge Saturn rockets. But then the sun rose, and that was magnificent, and it was a beautiful day. And the VIP stands were crowded, and I'm told that all along the roads along the coast in Florida, everybody had just stopped, and they were all standing by their cars, hoping to catch a glimpse of Apollo 11 as it took off.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Oh, boy. Oh, boy, it looks good, Wally.
Somebody must be leading the arms.
Building shaking. Getting that buffeting we've become used to. What a moment. Man on the way to the moon.
The landing, there was no similar focus. It was your television set in your living room.
That's right. And I remember the day in New York distinctly. We had a day in Delmarva here a week ago Friday where we had torrential rains, and that's the way it was in New York that day. Oh, it was terrible.
I was in a studio without windows, and I really can't remember much. Of course, I remember the landing, seeing on monitors.
Yes.
And you played that sound cut, and of course, that became the silliness of reporters. The focus on whether he said
yes.
a small step for a man, or whether he just said one small step for man.
Right.
that missing A, and I was listening particularly hard again today, trying to decide whether the static covered up an A or not.
Yes.
Neil Armstrong always insisted that he'd said the A.
Right.
But he was pretty well shouted down by all sorts of sound experts, audio experts at the time. And then much later, and I can't remember the details of this anymore, but there was some test that demonstrated that there inside that static that you heard, he did get the quote right. He didn't really plan it, he claims. I find that hard to believe. His whole life was one long.
Well, you knew Armstrong personally. What did you think of Neil?
Well, he was an enigma. He was, I certainly was not a friend of his. He was, and by that I don't mean we're enemies or anything like that, but I just didn't know him that well. As I can recall, I interviewed him no more than twice, and when you were with the networks, you got very long interviews with him.
Sure.
And leading up to that time. But he was tightly controlled by NASA and by Life magazine, who had the big contract then, which was very controversial. And Neil himself was not comfortable. Boy, you could see him squirm when you'd ask him, well, what do you feel about anything? You know,
yeah.
He was fine if you wanted to talk about a Framus. There were few astronauts that were probably as good an engineer as he was.
Yes.
He was recognized from the first as a person apart. I'll tell you, so was Alan Shepard, and then he had the illness.
Right.
But they were a cat of a different color. I knew Lovell quite well, and particularly after he retired from the space and was at the Smithsonian, and I got to know him even better in Washington.
Yes.
But Armstrong was, everybody described him, as I recall, as the reluctant hero.
Yes.
He was a good Presbyterian. He was an Eagle Scout. He had been a successful Navy pilot in the Korean War. Then he went into the civilian advanced flight experimental programs.
Right, right.
And then, but it was all very much engineering and like that whole, what do they call it, the right stuff?
Yeah. Go ahead.
He was, epitomized that too. Everything was yep and nope. And he did have a couple of close calls as an experimental pilot. I don't think he was necessarily liked by his colleagues. He was cold. And
he wasn't a warm and fuzzy type guy. Yeah.
There was some jealousy of him. There were
of course
other astronauts who would say things to me critically, and I just put it off as professional jealousy. Nobody ever was really quoted for the record except Chuck Yeager,
right,
who was a big civilian
test pilot
who had done a lot of the X-15 and earlier flights. So he didn't think much of Navy pilots.
Yeah. Well, I think Chuck thought he should have been president as well at some point.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I think so. And
go ahead.
And Armstrong, he was not originally scheduled for that flight, but he was certainly in line for it.
Right.
I no longer can recall what happened, but they had to switch missions. I think like one of the other crews ahead of him, the LEM pilot, got sick and could not make the scheduled mission.
Right.
And they had a substitute for that mission, and then that put them in line to do the later.
Wow.
It was something like that.
It's funny how those things work.
We spent a lot of time before the actual mission. I spent about 3 months filming little vignettes.
Yes.
That we were going to run every hour, I think, during the mission. And what was it, 72 hours or something like that? And these were finely crafted pieces of journalism featuring either a key piece of equipment or a key moment in the flight or a key personality from behind the scenes.
Right.
And we had, 75 of these things lined up. And after we ran about 3 of them, I talked to the executive producer, and we agreed that this was taking the focus away from nail biting.
Yeah, and that's what it was like. I mean, I was nervous. I was scared to death that whole day in anticipation of the landing, David.
Yeah, well, Armstrong, as I recall, said that it was no more than a 50-50 chance.
Right.
He felt they'd get back. He wasn't really that worried about about his safety, but he felt that the landing on the moon had too many unknowns, imponderables. I guess, that I was apprehensive or nervous about the success of it, but really from the time that Kennedy announced it, I had been involved enough in coverage that I was confident we would make it, whether it would be on a particular day or by the end of the decade.
Really? Even after Apollo 1,
really
David?
Thought, well, first of all, we had all of the science and just about all of the technology. Kennedy made sure of that before he announced it.
Yeah.
And so certainly it wasn't a slam dunk, though. I think I've heard people debate. I would say it was probably America's biggest technological feat since the Panama Canal.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I don't know that we've ever organized anything better or bigger. Some people would say that the Manhattan Project.
True.
And I'm not an expert in that, but I don't think it had as many moving parts.
No, and it did, and certainly wasn't watched all over the world as the Apollo moon landing was by people in every country. Now, after Apollo 1, now you were dispatched by CBS News to cover the Apollo 1 tragedy.
Right.
Did you have any doubts after that tragedy that we would make Kennedy's deadline by the end of the decade?
No.
Wow.
I didn't. That was terrible. I was very close to Gus Grissom.
Yeah.
I would say of all of the astronauts. There had been some concern about that spacecraft that I had voiced inside CBS, but we decided not to go with it. But there was too much riding on it, and our whole world standing vis-a-vis the Russians, we'd just taken a heck of a kick in the teeth with Sputnik, and then with Yuri Gagarin,
the first man in space.
Yeah. And we had this very feeble attempt. It was remarkable they did anything, but they shot Shepard downrange on a rocket, and then John Glenn in a not very advanced technically
Friendship
orbit.
7, right? Friendship 7.
But those really didn't match the Russians, but by the time and then as I said, there was all this other stuff about lost in the thicket of Vietnam and the Cuban Missile Crisis. There really was a question of whether we had lost it, lost our edge and our ability to be considered a leader of the world.